Welcome back to Ohio Counseling Conversations, the official podcast of the Ohio Counseling Association, bringing you updates and conversations from around the state. On today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Jamie Marich to talk about normalizing dissociation as an experience for our clients and ourselves, and help counselors better understand that experience. I'm your host today, Dr. Marisa Cargill, a counselor at Cuyahoga Community College and counselor educator at the University of Akron. Thanks for listening. Let's dig in. Jamie, welcome. We are so happy to have you here today. Before we get started on our discussion and conversation, could you tell us just a little bit about yourself for our listeners?
Sure. Well, since this is an Ohio Counseling Conversations podcast, I feel it's appropriate to start with the fact that I'm a lifelong Ohioan, was born and raised in Youngstown, Ohio. I've worked here my whole professional career, even though I travel internationally. I've remained based in Ohio. I worked in Europe at the very, very beginning of my career, but returned to Ohio for my graduate education. I'm an OCA member. I just love Ohio as my home base. I am a licensed professional clinical counselor supervisor, formerly an independent chemical dependency counselor, although I haven't kept that license active. I am a educator. I'm an author. I'm the director of the Institute for Creative Mindfulness, which is one of the largest EMDR therapy training programs in North America. And we're based in Ohio, but now because of online reach and my travel, we're able to take trainings all over the country and many places in the world. And I also work with a great network of faculty members, many of whom are based in Ohio, but many of whom are based other places in the US, to take EMDR training and expressive arts training into clinical settings where a lot more creative and trauma focused education can be needed. I'm also the author of many books. If you count the manuals and resources in that realm, probably about 13 in total. Most recently, Dissociation Made Simple, and the Trauma and the 12 Steps Revised and Expanded Workbook. So that is me in a nutshell. I guess we'll get into this in the conversation. We're also a person ourselves in long-term recovery from an addictive disorder. We live with dissociative identities, formerly a dissociative disorder, and we believe very much in talking candidly about our lived experience because we don't feel that counselors and other mental health professionals do that quite enough.
Yeah, and I'm excited that you're here to help build our insight and educate us so that this topic, especially in reference to dissociation, is better understood by our professional body, and in turn, then better able to support the communities where we serve. So thank you so much for joining us. As you mentioned, you recently wrote Dissociation Made Simple. Can you share a little more about what made you choose that topic and your definition of dissociation?
Let's start with the definition first, because a lot of people are overwhelmed whenever the word dissociation comes up. And I think we make it a lot harder than it needs to be. That if you look at the word origin of the word dissociate, it comes from a Latin root meaning to sever or to divide. And so when we really break it down, I ask my students, what is it we're severing or dividing from? And the answer is typically the present moment. So, what would make us sever or divide from the present moment? It's uncomfortable, it's painful, it's stressful. For many gifted children, it may even be boring. Or for children who are neurodivergent in any way, gifted, I think children are very often neurodivergent. That boredom could even be a reason to uh, cause dissociation. Although obviously we most dissociate it as happening in connection to painful trauma. And that dissociation can come in a variety of behaviors, many behaviors that we all do, like daydreaming, zoning out, losing concentration. It can also show up in more fragmentation or separation from parts or aspects of self. So that's what dissociation is. And something that really started us, because every time I go to write a book, it is really the end point of my process, because I have taught on it for many years before that. I've talked and I've had conversations with it. I've done a lot of my own introspection about it. So the book is really the culmination, or at least a point along this continued journey I have about trying to normalize the dissociative experience and to try to diffuse a lot of the fear that many clinical professionals have about it. So we ourselves were diagnosed in 2004 when we were in graduate school with our dissociative disorder. And when we were diagnosed, our life suddenly made sense. Getting treated for it helped us really be able to embrace this field in a full way. But for many years, we didn't talk about it because it's one of those diagnoses you just don't talk about because people aren't going to take you seriously. But as a result, I went to a lot of conferences and I tried to educate myself on dissociation, and even in trauma circles like EMDR communities and other conferences that are centered more on trauma, I would hear people talk about dissociation with such a terror or spread a lot of misinformation about it. At a certain point, we became sick of it personally. So around 2011, we started dipping our toe in the water of talking about being a person with dissociative experiences. And in 2018, we fully came out. I mean, a lot of people at that point knew who I had shared with in conversations and in a few of my courses, but I wrote an article in 2018 really alerting the field that there are way more therapists who identify as having dissociative disorders than you think, and we have a lot to say. And that was the start of me really writing about it and more fully teaching about it in 2018. And then the book, I started researching it more fully because I had already been gathering a lot of information as I taught. I started researching it more fully in 2021. And at that point, I wanted to bring in interviews of other people with dissociative disorders, dissociative experiences, people who experience dissociation as part of other diagnoses. And I wanted to conduct interviews in a way that weren't so beaten down by research. And what I mean by that is I used a phenomenological research method to ask the questions. And I also decided that trying to quantify this, or I didn't decide, I concluded that trying to quantify a lot of these experiences just really takes the nuance out of it, even in a qualitative method. So I really made the decision in the book, Dissociation Made Simple, that I was going to be very candid about my voice and my position as a trauma expert, as a trauma professional with a dissociative, I don't even like to say dissociative disorder anymore, with dissociative identities, but amplifying the voices of other people who have leveraged and used dissociation in their life. So that was what started the book idea, and it came out in 2023, and I'm just delighted that it's continuing to spark conversation.
Yeah, this I you said so many things in those moments that I'm like, "Oh, yeah." Like, I appreciate you sharing how, like, validating a diagnosis can be, because I've had that own experience, like, in neurodivergence of, like, "Oh, now I can put something to it, like, it makes more sense," and then also normalizing this experience that, especially as counselors, there might be a reason why some of us want to divide or sever from the current moment when we experience so much in the roles that we fulfill. So I appreciate you sharing all of that. That's really insightful. So recently we had another episode where we were joined by a mental health and recovery board that really, as one of their foundational philosophies, said, hey, trauma informed care has to be at the root of what we do. What do you think it means to be trauma informed, and how do you see trauma and dissociation partnering up?
Yeah. I think to understand what it means to be trauma informed, like with dissociation, we got to look at what it even means. So, trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound. And there are a lot of technical definitions about trauma out there from an energetic, from a neurobiological perspective. There are a lot of models out there for looking at trauma. The DSM certainly has its system for looking at certain trauma related disorders. Yet, from a human perspective, it really is just about human woundedness. So, trauma informing care means, do we really acknowledge the role that human woundedness plays in the problems that people navigate in their day to day life? That it's not just something's wrong with you, something's wrong with your brain. One of the axioms of the trauma informed care movement is it's not about what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And what were the series of responses. And dissociation is one of those responses. So I am all about all facets of society becoming more trauma informed, because that means when you're trauma informed, you understand what human wounding is and you understand the impact it can have on human behavior. And that it's not just so easy for people to snap out of it, for instance. And then you could go into a little more specificity with the neurobiology of the brain to look at how traumatic memories are stored in the brain. And that can further impact a person's capacity to respond instead of react. And dissociation is one of those trauma responses. And for a lot of children, especially who grow up in environments that we can characterize as traumatizing, dissociation can become a real default, a norm. And even one of the models I've worked on with a colleague looks even at addiction as something that is just a fuller development of dissociative responses, because addictions can be those things we pick up or engage in or put in our body that accelerate dissociative
Right.
responses.
That
So
escape.
yes, that's the nutshell of what we have to say on it.
Yeah. So I think you hit on this, and I appreciate you also saying like this is not necessarily a disorder as much as it's a response and a reaction to what someone has experienced. Why is it so important for counselors to have a deeper understanding of dissociation?
Yes, for two reasons. One is that, well, this is the big reason, but there's two sides to it. So that's what I meant by two reasons. The field is a place that either denies the existence of dissociative disorders, because you still hear many professionals, particularly psychiatrists, say things like dissociation's not real, DID's not real, it's made up, it's too bizarre to be real. And for me, a lot of that denial comes from a historical denial we've had about the impact of trauma, especially on women's experiences. So, yes, that's one side of our field where it tends to be dissociation doesn't exist. And the other side tends to be, well, yeah, we know dissociation or DID is real, but I got to be careful. I don't really want to touch it because I don't want to break them even further. Or if I do this therapy I've been trained in, I can do further damage. So I did a TikTok once where it's like, which is it? Like, do we not exist, or do we exist and we're too much to handle? So, as somebody who's really horrified by both of these narratives, uh, the reason we need to have more discussions and advocacy about what dissociation really is to really dispute both of those. And I always say, professionals, before you judge us, really get to know us, because so many professionals, even professionals who can be very well trained, are judging us by implicit biases, by what they've seen in media, by what they've heard in their graduate programs. I mean, when I was in graduate school in 2003, 2004, I heard dissociation DID is so rare, don't worry about it. There's only ever been a couple hundred cases in all of humankind. And, somebody's probably faking if they're coming to you with it. And sadly, I've still heard students of mine in EMDR training still being told that in graduate programs, or being told it very recently. So, yes, that we have to amplify and have more public conversations about what dissociation really is.
Yeah, I'm glad we're having this conversation
I
because I
am
think
too.
you're hitting home on so many things. I'm also a counselor educator, so like my brain always is like, how are we addressing this in our counselor education with our students? And yeah, if they're getting, the bare minimum and it's maybe not even accurate, that's really important for us to demystify. So, I think that this is such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. I'm getting really excited about everything I'm
Yay.
learning and that you're sharing, because I think this is going to be such a great tool for our membership. So the book talks a little bit about sort of what you're bringing up here, is that like counselors, the mental health field has maybe gotten some stuff wrong in how we define and conceptualize trauma, especially in regards to dissociation. Can you say more about that?
So, I know when I came up in my counselor education, it was very much that trauma was a specialty. I believe in my counselor training program, it was, yes, this is something you can learn about after graduate school as a specialty. And I even had a classmate say, why don't we have a class on trauma here in this school? It's not in the K Crep, whatever, at least at the time. I don't know if they've shifted on that in any way. Uh, and this is something I really give credit to EMDR therapy for giving me, because EMDR therapy was the approach that really helped us in our journey early on. And we got trained in it within a year after getting licensed, and it really has defined our career. But so much of the EMDR approach really argues that everything one way or another is trauma. And let me speak to that, because I know there's a lot of blowback now about, well, we've gone too far with calling everything trauma. I don't think we have. If you understand that trauma is wound, and wounds come in various shapes and sizes, and the issue is not so much the trauma, it's whether or not it's been healed, whether it's had a chance to be given the proper treatment that it needs. So, yes, I think if trauma isn't causing mental health or addiction distress, that at very least it's exacerbating it. Because even if you take a mental health diagnosis, schizophrenia is always the example that comes to mind, because it's usually something that is seen as having a lot of organic causality, right? I don't know of any schizophrenic individual that I've treated or encountered who hasn't experienced trauma as a result of navigating life with that diagnosis. What they have to go through, what they have to experience, the taunts, et cetera, et cetera. So even if trauma isn't causing something, I believe having to navigate life with a major mental health disorder creates trauma. So it can be exacerbating something. So just like many of the older models for looking at mental health are centered around, what's the causality? Is it negative beliefs? Is it imbalance in the family system? Is it under psychic interpsychic conflicts that we have to talk out? The EMDR therapeutic approach has always looked at trauma as the issue. And so that's a big point that I think we're missing. And to be very clear, I'm not saying you all have to run out and become EMDR therapists yet. I think a lot of the spirit of EMDR philosophy or underlying model and theory, thank you,
Right.
I was looking for that
The
word,
roots there.
yes, can inform this idea that, yes, one way or another, trauma has something to do with it. And that trauma is more than just intrapersonal, it is systemic. Think of the way that so many of our systems have been set up to put marginalized people at a disadvantage purposely. Think of the way that so much of society is positioned to tell people, well, stuff it in, shove it in, because if you feel feelings, you're going to cause problems. And literally, like with weight trauma and body trauma, we tell people to suck it in. We tell people that taking up space is an issue. So there's so many layers this can be looked at with trauma. And then, as one of my colleagues, Amy Wagner, likes to say, if trauma is parking your car, no, if trauma is walking through your door, dissociation's parking the car. It's like they go hand in hand, especially if the trauma exposure has been more chronic.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate you talking about like it's that core wound, right? That it might
Mm-hmm.
be part of the experience, and for us to look at someone who maybe doesn't have a trauma related diagnosis, we don't know, because what wounds one person might not wound another person, and how they experience and navigate the world relies on all those variables that we are taught to pay attention to, from like the biopsychosocial, spiritual, um,
Mm-hmm.
back like approach. We're trying to consider all these variables, and trauma needs to be one of those.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, how do you think we as counselors can do better with this?
My short answer is I think we have to look at our own areas of unhealed wounding first. We need to look at where we dissociate, because unfortunately, in this field from the beginning, I have seen a great amount of othering. We are the experts. We have it all together. We have to have these very rigid boundaries. And these are the people with disorders that we need to diagnose and treat. And I know my self inquiry as I have gotten better as a clinician, the more I've done my own work over the years. So I think when you as a clinician of any stripe, any licensure background, etc., have an understanding of your own trauma areas that need to be healed, where dissociation shows up in your life, it becomes a lot less scary to navigate it in others. And I'm not saying, work out your stuff on other people. That is definitely
Right,
not what I'm
right.
saying. But what people like, I was doing an interview like this once, and somebody asked me what's been the biggest gift I've gotten out of being a counselor, and specifically a trauma counselor. And the short answer is, every time a client trips me up or triggers me in some way, it is an invitation for me to go to my own therapist or my own healing team to say, this is what I need to work on further. And I don't think I would have had that if I had become a CPA. Maybe if I became an attorney or a doctor, I don't know.
Maybe,
But
but yeah.
this field has really inspired me to go further within, and for that I'm grateful. And I do feel, and if anybody, board level is listening to this, we need to be willing to give counselors and other professional CE or some kind of credit for doing their own therapy or healing retreats, because I think we learn more there than we do in a lot of trainings that are out there. And I say that as a trainer.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, I love that because I think a lot of what you've said, there's this theme of us of our humanity that we can't separate ourselves from our humanness, and then that also means we can't separate ourselves from our wounds sometimes, but we do need to maybe call ourselves to reflect and heal, like you're
right.
saying.
Mhm.
So I love that. Yeah. What challenges do you think people who experience dissociation exist for them finding competent providers to help them cope with this experience?
This is still a big challenge for people who have dissociative disorders. We were lucky, blessed, use whatever term fits for your belief system, that in 2004 in Ohio, we found an LPCCS who really got it. Like, who just really got it. She had a lot of outstanding trauma training. She was able to accurately identify the dissociation and treat us very well. We know that's not everybody's experience, because a lot of folks still run up against being diagnosed with everything but a dissociative disorder or everything but PTSD. It's, you're bipolar, you're ADHD. And it's not to say that these conditions don't exist, because they certainly can, or sometimes they exist concurrently with trauma. But unfortunately, I still see this trend towards medical model. Let's get you on just the perfect medication. And once more, we're not anti medication, not by any means, but it's like we're getting at everything but the root issue, which is unhealed trauma and dissociation. And on average, it takes, this is the general statistic that's going around now, it takes a person with a dissociative disorder 8 years to get accurately diagnosed, because they're often being volleyed around to therapists who deny it, who look at everything through so much of a medical lens. And yeah, one of the most numerous questions I get coming into my email box is, can you recommend somebody therapeutically who's not going to be afraid of dissociation?
Wow. Yeah. I think that that speaks to a national concern and issue, but even in the state, we just received a report of Community Action Agency, like on poverty. And they talked about like the lack of providers in the state, and especially those like with Medicare, Medicaid, that can be really challenging. And add that to the mix of, this may be overlooked or not well understood experience, that's going to make it even more challenging for someone
Mhm.
um, who's trying to find appropriate care.
And I talk a little bit about this in Dissociation Made Simple, because this again is a systemic issue. And I never like to say, others have challenged me on this, it's not that the system is broken, as that's, the system is set up to uphold these tiers of white supremacy, wealth supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. And the unfortunate reality is that so many of the best therapists out there who really have the training to work with trauma and dissociation inevitably go into private practice, because we hate the way we're treated at agency levels of care. And we're underpaid and overworked. And this is where people with Medicaid, Medicare who most need the care are most likely to end up. And I don't have an easy answer for this here because I went into private practice. I attempt to give back where I can and to train people who are in agency settings to be able to offer this care. Yet we have to look at systemically why there's such an exodus from
Yeah.
mental health, from community mental health.
Yeah. And that is one thing that the director of that board said is pay counselors, pay
Hmm.
counselors more because that is part of the systemic issue. So
Hmm.
I appreciate you speaking to that too.
Oh,
Um,
we'll speak to all the stuff that people don't want to talk about.
Yeah, love that. That's what these conversations are about. So,
Great.
um, you mentioned TikTok earlier, and you got a fan
Yes.
in me because my dissertation was all about social media.
Ooh.
Yeah, so DID communities have formed on TikTok and some other social media spaces where there are influencers with no clinical training backgrounds, large followings, and they share their stories. They self advocate. What are some of the benefits you see from consuming information like this? And in what ways do you think maybe it's harmful?
Yeah, I love talking about this. So I'm really glad we're going here. And
Yeah,
please
this is
send me
my
a copy of
jam.
your dissertation
Will
because I
do.
really would
Will
love to read
do.
what you came up with. Wow, because overall, I'm a fan of what's happening on social media, TikTok especially. I will say, and I'll give this caveat up front, of course, there is stuff to wade through that may not be the most helpful, but I think that's true in any venue of information in life. In my field, I've had to wade through stuff that's not very helpful at conferences or that can be harmful. I mean, I will say this, and you can take this for what it's worth. I am PhD, written all these books, spoken at international conferences. I have a lot of academic credibility. And I feel more understood by the DID community and more seen by the DID community than I do by a lot of the establishment researching dissociation. I think there's a humanity there. There's a social art that happens on social media, which is part of the paradigm of public psychology. Because I know pop psychology always, oh, this is pop psychology, it's pop psychology. And that's elitist to just write it off as pop psychology. It's public psychology. It's people using the public forum to self advocate, to share information. And with DID, especially, this is a diagnosis where before social media was even a thing, I have a friend who was diagnosed, for instance, in the early 90s, and she was discouraged and actually chided by a therapist for going to the library and trying to find out more. And a lot of DID clients are told, to stay off social media because it's just going to feed your head with these crazy ideas. And I think, and I've only really got on TikTok last year, mostly to kind of check out because I get asked questions like this. And and my publisher kind of gently said, Jamie, we think you'd be really good on TikTok with how you share stuff. And so yeah, we are on TikTok now as a professional who's also out, and we do share mixed content. But I think TikTok and a lot of social media is a place for democratizing knowledge that is threatening to the elite facets of our field, whether they be academic or whether they be the people who are training and marketing their services for working with trauma. I mean, with the DID community, yes, of course, I can have some concerns about systems airing their beefs with each other on social media. And I think sometimes creators can focus more on what are considered the more dramatic elements of DID, like switching. And a lot of us in the community, but our answer has now been tell our story on social media. That switching for many of us is not that dramatic or that obvious, and our lives can be places that are very routine. But overall, I think TikTok's a fascinating place, and it says a lot that so many governments and state systems want to ban TikTok because yeah, there's a lot happening there with leveling the playing
Yeah,
field with information and
yeah,
advocacy.
and organizing. And
Mhm.
you mentioned like people sharing their stories, but I think it's also just as important like the accessing of stories because
Mhm.
there's some validation in like hearing you're not alone.
Oh,
So if you can't access group counseling or even individual counseling,
mhm.
that community, whether you share your story or not, feels like gives you an inherent like belonging to a
Yes.
community.
And
And so
honestly,
that's powerful.
yes, and that's one of the reasons I'm even shifting more of my teaching towards writing books, which in the end of the day are a little more economical to buy,
Hmm.
and or sharing content on social media where there is a real thirst for knowledge and help, because
Hmm.
so many of our folks aren't getting it in the communities where
Hmm.
they need to be able to access it.
Hmm. And I actually presented with some colleagues about this at the last conference last fall, about like TikTok therapy as an overall umbrella, not with any specific diagnosis,
Mhm.
but that it can be a really great way to build connection with your therapist,
Mhm.
and start conversations
Yes.
rather than minimizing it or dismissing it
Yes.
as the clinician.
Because to that point, I did a TikTok on this, weirdly enough. I'll send it to you,
Yeah.
where I share how many of my colleagues come to me with questions like, now every young kid on my caseload thinks they have DID because of TikTok. And like it's this big problem. And my response to that is use it to have a conversation. You can explain to your client, yes, not everything's diagnosable dissociation, yet I'm curious what you're relating to in what the A system has to share or what Pixie has to share. And yeah, I don't know if you're even aware of this, but as a social media person, I think you would be interested in this, that there was a big blow up earlier this year in the DID community because a very academic leader in the field of dissociation at both an international conference last year and at a grand rounds at his hospital did a presentation essentially pulling up different TikTok creators and saying why they were faking it without their permission, without their consent. He was using their social art in his presentation. Dr. Matthew Robinson was his name, and is his name, and saying, this is why they're faking it. And one of the big points he was making is that it's not possible for a person with DID to be so proud of having DID. That typically people with DID are covered in shame and they're not going to be broadcasting it on social media. So there's a term for this now, fake claiming, where you use somebody's content as a professional or an expert to call out why someone's faking. And a lot of us in the community just uproared at this, especially those of us
Yeah.
who are credentialed and with lived experience, really from a place of how
Like,
dare you.
yeah, you should be ashamed is like the message that it's sending.
Yes, and what
Yeah.
I really challenge some of the people close to this on is, I don't know where you're getting this narrative that shame is equated with the diagnosis. Yet if any of us are feeling shame, it's because of the establishment like you
Hmm.
folks who say that
Yeah. And
we're
if
we're we're tied
anything,
up in shame.
yeah, and if anything, our role as therapists should be to help
Right.
remove that shame.
And I think we thank you. Yes. And I think we are seeing a pride movement in
Yeah.
the dissociative community, which we colloquially will call the plural community or the multiple community, similar to what we saw with gay pride, queer pride happen, through the 70s and 80s. That, and many of us are even going as far as, maybe we need to even take this out of being diagnostic criteria in that. And what I mean by that is, like, I know DID, DSM, in order to justify treatment to get a diagnosis, it might be a good fit at the time, but a lot of us now who no longer meet clinical threshold, like, people ask me all the time, do you still identify as having partial DID or OSDD, or do you still identify as having DID? And a lot of us will say we are people with dissociative identities. Like, our systems are intact. We are proud to be plural. We're proud to be systems, but we no longer meet. And we know that that's just like jaw dropping to so many people in the field. Like, how can you be proud to be this? But this is a lot of stuff queer folks were told, to my understanding, in previous generations. And I'm also a queer person, so I'm grateful for the trails that were blazed before me to feel better about being out in this day and age. And I hope many of us are now doing that for people with dissociative identities and other dissociative disorders.
Yeah, needing to say the disorder kind of reflects that archaic model
Mhm.
that may exist
Mhm.
in ways where we need it for diagnosis and coverage and things like that, but in ways that are liberating for our clients, not so much.
Yes, right on.
Okay, yeah, okay. Well, thank you. I I could go with social media conversation all day, but we do have a couple other questions that
Sure.
I think are going to be beneficial to counselors listening, new professionals, but I think old professionals too, because we all have work to do on ourselves. In what ways do you think we can benefit from exploring our relationship with the ways we dissociate? And what are some
Yes.
of those common ways you think like that might show up for us?
So this is at the heart of a lot of my teaching on it in the Dissociation Made Simple book and other courses I teach. And that is inviting therapists, counselors to do what I call a dissociative profile first, to look at one's own tendencies to dissociate. And that could be something as simple as when a client starts talking about something that brings up activation for me, especially at the end of the day when I'm tired, I feel like I drift off a little bit. And it might be very hard for me to pay attention to the client. And this is when I notice that that's happening. This is what I could do to attune myself back to mindful awareness. But then part of really studying the profile is what can I do preventatively? So that may be before those harder sessions at the end of the day when I'm tired. I make an effort to smell one of my favorite oils, go outside for some air, do a couple yoga stretches, know how to press my feet into the ground or breathe in a certain way when I'm having these problematic sessions. Part of the dissociative profile can be what do I do to unwind in the evening? And yeah, something for folks who are not in recovery might be like I have a glass of wine at the end of the day to unwind, which can be fine. But at what point might it cross a line into being more problematically dissociative to cut me off from my feelings or my experiences? Is overworking dissociative? Is it something that keeps us from going there with our feelings and just being a human being? But then we can also look at how much of that dissociation to overwork is there because it's expected of us in order to the systemic. You are exactly right. So part of what I do in the Dissociation Made Simple book and in a lot of my trainings is let's look at the ways we all dissociate like that. And I also ask people to consider maybe the hardest thing you've been through in your life. How difficult was it to stay present? And can you use this information to help you better step into your client's shoes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So understanding, like building that insight.
Mhm.
Yeah. How do you think that this shows up in other diagnoses, not just like a DID
Oh,
situation?
yeah, and that's why I was grateful so many Dissociation Made Simple contributors spoke to other diagnoses, especially PTSD or complex PTSD. That dissociation and even having identifiable parts can be a threat of those. Many folks spoke from the perspective of eating disorders or addictive disorders, really identifying these behaviors as dissociative responses. I think like I said earlier, trauma, if it's not causing something, it's exacerbating something. That
Mm-hmm.
dissociation on at least a subtle level can be showing up in any clinical diagnosis.
Yeah. Yeah. Like in what ways are you checking out and
Yes.
maybe not using that terminology dissociate, but
Right.
we do check out or distract in some ways that could be useful, but in other ways that are maybe not allowing us to experience what
Yes.
will help our healing.
And I'm glad you said that could be useful because the other part of normalizing dissociation is recognizing where it has been adaptive and useful and helpful. And I know that often comes up as an example with, yes, of course, if you're surviving an abusive situation, dissociation can be helpful, yet I still use it in a lot of my life to drown out distractions, to be able to answer questions because all of my parts are kind of giving me some feedback here on how to answer a question. This may freak out some listeners or startle some listeners, but even as we've talked today, yes, Dr. Jamie has been up front, but all of my parts and sides of myself have been helping me answer these questions from our experience. So there's a lot of ways dissociation has been helpful and necessary, just as there's been a lot of ways it can get in the way of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, do you mind speaking more to that where you say like getting in the way? Some examples of that?
Well, sure. I mean, the DSM clinical counseling term is it causing functional impairment? So if you're switching in the middle of your job when, let's say, a customer triggers you or startles you or says something you don't like, that may make you prone to get fired if you go off in a certain way. A resource I want to recommend for listeners is a beautiful short film called Petals of a Rose by Dylan Crumpler. I could send it to you for the show notes. It's a short film that was made by the son of a woman with DID. And as a filmmaker, he really has a passion for sharing more accurate portrayals in media. And in Petals of a Rose, you see how a woman with DID is finally in a really decent dating relationship, but even that is making her feel a little uneasy because it's, how do I tell him? And then when they go to have a romantic encounter, the parts just kind of collapse on her because they all have a different opinion about her. So yeah, that can get in the way. uh, Obviously driving a car may be a safety issue, if or caring for your children could be, you know, so I'm saying could be. It's not automatic, because I think sometimes we get into this label of, well, they have a dissociative disorder, they can't drive, or they have a dissociative disorder and they can't be a I know tons of folks with DID who are tremendous parents, especially when they build the insight of knowing where their triggers or issues are, to be able to make plans for care.
Hmm. That's important to build that awareness too. Like it isn't an other like situation where we are othering. Like that there are people who are very capable,
Right.
who might have like this type of experience in their lives.
Correct.
So
Hmm.
wonderful. So this last question is something that we ask on every episode because the name of the
Sure.
podcast is Ohio Counseling Conversations.
Yeah.
What are important conversations you think counseling professionals should be having with each other? And you can take it two ways, and or their clients in the state of Ohio.
Conversations like we've been having on this, what is it, hmm what is it that's getting in the way or causing more of this us versus them? Because, I know I went to a graduate program in the state of Ohio, and we didn't, granted it was almost 20 years ago, but and it was in a very religious setting, but we didn't have these kind of conversations about working on our own issues as therapists, about seeing clients as people really who are just like us. And so much of the old boundary messages, even though I think good therapeutic boundaries are needed, but this whole idea of don't share of yourself too much is rooted in a lot of problematic supremacist thinking, elitist thinking. And I know people in graduate programs have been told things like, you have to keep it together, don't show your humanity as a therapist. And yeah, we have to look at why that's the case. I teach a CE on navigating self-disclosure, both in clinical settings and in public forums like this on an interview. And it's one of my most favorite courses that I teach, because we do dive in to conversations like this. Um, I will say this, I don't know when the podcast is going to air. I know you'll have listeners who won't like this, and I really hope you don't edit it out, but we have to have conversations about reproductive justice and other social justice issues, especially as we go to vote on this in our state in November. I hate any of this thinking that therapy is apolitical. And I, on one hand, do recognize that people of all political orientations do deserve mental health care. And I think as therapists, especially amongst other therapists, we must be having these conversations about how certain policies and laws in our state are really impacting our most vulnerable clients who are coming through.
Yeah, yeah. I hear that, and I think don't worry, this isn't getting edited out. I think it's
Yay.
important for us to also give voice to each other, and
Hmm.
so whether or not every counselor in Ohio agrees, I think it's important to hear perspective and recognize what's rooted in some of our ethical foundation and how that might pertain to some of the legislation that's being pushed in our state
Hmm.
and across the nation. So I appreciate you speaking to it. So, any other conversations that you think should be being had?
well, since you said this is not going to be edited out, and we're going there. I mean, just the fact that I had to say that as an outspoken person, feeling like, uh-oh, this is Ohio. This is a state that's leaning progressively more conservative. We also have to be talking about the line between, yes, I think a client has a right to have their religion, their spiritual practices brought into the counseling process if that is their desire. Yet we, are in a state, we're in a country where Christian values are still dictating a lot of our laws. Or I should say certain people's interpretations of Christian values are dictating a lot of our laws that impact our clients. And that's part of my passion for social justice. One of my clinical specialties within trauma is spiritual abuse and religious trauma, which is what a lot of people with dissociative disorders have experienced on some level. So there is a lot of overlap there. Yet, especially as an Ohio specific conversation, I think this is something we have to have, where increased competency in acknowledging that religion and spirituality can be helpful to many of our clients, but it has also been harmful to so many of our clients. And I know a lot of therapists, because of their beliefs, can still get offended by that or tiptoe around that. And I would like to see more recognition of the role that especially Christian supremacy has played in many folks' developments.
Mm-hmm. And I, as a counselor educator, have witnessed like that showing up in my classrooms too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's an important conversation that you're bringing up. So maybe we'll have to have you back for another episode at some
Well, I
point. That would be
do.
great.
Again, Ohio specific. My next book is coming out next fall called You Lied to Me About God. And it is my personal memoir about growing up with parents who were both extremely devout in two different branches of Christianity. And one was evangelical, one's Catholic. And it just taught me a lot about the impact of what a lot of us are calling Christian supremacy. But I also approach a lot of my teaching and writing is it's not just picking on Christianity, because you see a lot of these themes in many different spiritual, religious, even the non-denominational and the spiritual,
Mm-hmm.
not religious yoga type
Oh yeah.
communities. So I'm
All the
always
documentaries I love to
all the
watch. Yes.
documentaries, right?
Yep.
Any
Yep.
Wild Wild Country fans out there?
Yeah.
Yes.
So awesome. Well, thank you so much. Do you want to plug anything, your socials or website or anything like that before we wrap up?
Well, since we talked about TikTok, if you are a TikToker, I am Trauma Therapist Rants on TikTok. That's also a handle I use on Instagram. Also have Dr. Jamie M on Instagram. Probably the best website you can go to for more of my content around Dissociation Made Simple is www.redefinetherapy.com. And then my professional training website is instituteforcreativemindfulness.com. And that's where you
Wonderful.
can find out about EMDR training.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We'll make sure we plug all of that in the show notes as well. We are so happy that you joined us today, Dr. Jamie. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for a great conversation.
Ohio Counseling Conversations is on a mission to make this podcast meaningful to you, and we can't do that without your help. A feedback form is linked in the show notes for this episode and is also available on the OCA Linktree. If you have any recommendations for topics or guests or any other general feedback, you can let us know by using the form. We welcome your thoughts so that we can continue to develop the podcast and grow as creators. If you are interested in joining the team or being a guest, you can also reach us by emailing ohiocounselingconversations@gmail.com. We value your insight. Thank you so much for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to follow us so you can stay up to date with Ohio Counseling Conversations online and wherever you listen to podcasts.
This podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Counseling Association's Media, Public Relations, and Membership Committee and its podcast subcommittee. Views, beliefs, or references mentioned in this episode do not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the Ohio Counseling Association. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect the view of the Ohio Counseling Association or any of its officials. Thank you.